We hold it in our hands as a single volume, bound in leather, its pages thin as whispers. For billions, it is not merely a book, but the book, the Word of God, a divine monologue spoken by the Creator of the universe. Perfect, infallible, and eternal. It is presented as a monolith, a seamless story from Genesis to Revelation, written with a single, divine purpose. We are taught that its authors were merely channels, holy secretaries taking dictation from on high. This idea of a perfect, divinely authored text is perhaps the most powerful claim made by the world's great religions. It is the foundation upon which doctrines are built, laws are made, and lives are governed. But what if that foundation is not solid rock, but sand? What if the Bible and other sacred texts like it are not a monolith, but a library? A library filled with books written by dozens of different, often anonymous, human authors over 1,000 years, each with their own distinct style, theology, and agenda. What if this library was assembled by a series of committees whose members argued fiercely over which books to include and which to burn? And what if, even after the books were chosen, the words themselves were changed, edited, and reinterpreted by scribes and translators with their own biases? This video is an investigation into the human fingerprints all over these divine documents. We will pull back the curtain on the messy, political, and profoundly human process that created the Word of God. Our investigation begins with the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah or the Pentateuch. Tradition holds they were written by a single author, Moses, who received them directly from God on Mount Sinai. For centuries, this was accepted as fact. However, by the 19th century, scholars began noticing strange inconsistencies. The text refers to Moses in the third person. It describes his death. Most strikingly, it contains dozens of doublets, 2 different, often contradictory versions of the same story. There are 2 creation stories, 2 accounts of the covenant with Abraham, and 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. God is even called by 2 different names, sometimes the personal Yahweh, and other times the more generic Elohim. This led scholars to develop the documentary hypothesis, a theory which proposes that the Torah is not the work of one author, but a patchwork quilt woven together from at least 4 distinct sources, written by different authors or schools of thought at different times in Israel's history. These sources, known as J, E, D, and P, each have a unique voice. The J source, the Yahwist, presents a very anthropomorphic God who walks in the Garden of Eden. The P source, the priestly author, is concerned with ritual, purity laws, and genealogies. These different texts were skillfully edited together centuries later to form a single narrative, but the seams are still visible. The contradictions are not errors. They are the fossilized evidence of different human authors with different concerns, all preserved in one text. The Word of God begins to sound more like a conversation or even an argument. This pattern of multiple distinct voices continues powerfully in the New Testament. The centerpiece of Christianity is the story of Jesus, yet we are given not one account, but 4. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not just complementary perspectives. They are often in direct contradiction with one another. They disagree on the details of Jesus' birth, the order of events in his ministry, the words he spoke on the cross, and the story of his resurrection. For instance, in Matthew and Mark, Jesus' last words are a cry of despair. My God, why have you forsaken me?" But in Luke, he is serene and forgiving. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." In John, he is triumphant and in control. "It is finished." He cannot have said all 3. These differences are not mistakes. They are the result of 4 different authors, writing for 4 different communities with 4 distinct theological goals. Mark, the earliest gospel, portrays a very human, suffering Jesus. Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience, goes to great lengths to present Jesus as the new Moses, fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Luke, writing for a Gentile audience, emphasizes Jesus' compassion for the poor and the outcast. And John, the latest gospel, presents a high divine Christology where Jesus is a cosmic being, the pre-existent Word of God. These are not 4 photographs of the same man. They are 4 painted portraits, each rendered in a different artistic style to emphasize a different truth about its subject. They are invaluable historical documents that tell us how early Christians thought about Jesus, but they are not a unified factual biography. For every book that made it into our modern Bible, there were dozens that were left on the cutting room floor. In the first few centuries after Christ, there was no Bible. Instead, there were Christianities, a vibrant, chaotic, and diverse marketplace of competing beliefs, each with its own set of revered texts. Some groups, known as Gnostics, believed the God of the Old Testament was an evil, inferior being, and that salvation came from secret knowledge, or gnosis, delivered by Jesus. Their Gospels, like the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Philip, reflect this radically different worldview. They were never going to be included in a canon assembled by bishops who worshipped the God of the Old Testament. The lost Gospels give us a breathtaking glimpse into the diversity of early Christian thought. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Egypt in 1945, is a collection of 114 secret sayings of Jesus, with no narrative of his life, death, or resurrection. It presents a path to salvation through understanding his cryptic wisdom. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene not as a penitent sinner, but as a preeminent apostle, the one who understood Jesus' secret teachings better than the male disciples, much to Peter's jealous dismay. The infancy Gospel of Thomas depicts a young, superpowered Jesus who performs bizarre and often petulant miracles, like striking a boy dead for bumping into him and then bringing him back to life. These texts were not forgeries. They were authentic, ancient documents beloved by certain Christian communities. They were simply written by the losers of a theological and political war. So who decided which books were in and which were out? It wasn't a single, divine decree, but a long, slow, and intensely human process of debate, politics, and power struggles. This process of creating a canon, a word that means measuring stick, was driven by the need for one group, the proto-Orthodox bishops, to establish control and define what it meant to be a true Christian. One of the first attempts to create a canon came from a man named Marcion in the 2nd century. Marcion was a Gnostic who believed the wrathful God of the Old Testament was incompatible with the loving Father of Jesus. So he created his own Bible, consisting only of an edited version of Luke's Gospel and some of Paul's letters. The Orthodox Church was horrified and excommunicated him as a heretic, but his actions forced them to begin defining their own official list of scriptures to counter him. The arguments for inclusion could be surprisingly arbitrary. The 2nd century bishop Irenaeus famously argued that there must be exactly 4 Gospels, no more and no less, because there are 4 corners of the earth, 4 principal winds, and 4 living creatures in Revelation. This is not a theological argument. It's an argument from numerological convenience. The most pivotal moment in this process, however, was political. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. He wanted a unified, stable religion to help unify his vast and fractured empire. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. While this council's main purpose was to settle the debate over the divinity of Christ, it marked the first time that imperial state power was used to enforce Christian orthodoxy. Creating a single, unified Bible was a key part of creating a single, unified imperial church. The final, official, list of 27 New Testament books wasn't formally agreed upon until the Synod of Carthage in 397 CE, centuries after the books were written. The Canon was closed not by a revelation, but by a vote. Even after the list of books was finalized, the text itself was far from stable. Before the printing press, every copy of every book had to be made by hand. The scribes who performed this painstaking work were only human. They made accidental errors, skipping a line, misspelling a word, or misreading the text they were copying. But sometimes the changes were intentional. Scribes would sometimes alter a verse to make it conform more closely to their own theology or to correct a perceived difficulty. A famous example is the comma Johanneum, a phrase in 1 John that explicitly mentions the Trinity. Textual analysis has proven that this phrase was not in the original Greek manuscripts, but was added by later scribes to provide a clear biblical proof for the doctrine of the Trinity. The Word of God was being actively edited by its copyists. The challenge of translation presented another profoundly human layer of intervention. Every translation is an act of interpretation. A single word choice can dramatically alter the meaning of a passage and create an entire doctrine. The most famous example is the Hebrew word Alma in the book of Isaiah, which means young woman. When Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek centuries later for the Septuagint, they chose the Greek word Parthenos to translate Alma. While Parthenos can mean young woman, it more commonly means virgin. When the author of Matthew's Gospel, writing in Greek, read this passage, he saw a prophecy of a virgin birth, which he then applied to Jesus. A simple translation choice became the foundation of one of Christianity's central dogmas. This process continued throughout history. When St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, creating the Vulgate that would be the standard for 1,000 years, his personal choices shaped Western theology. When the Bible was translated into English, the politics were fierce. William Tyndale was executed for his unauthorized translation. The King James Version, for all its poetic beauty, was a political project initiated by King James to create a text that would reinforce the authority of the monarchy and the Church of England. The Bible you read today is not a pure stream from a divine source. It is the end result of a long, human game of telephone, passed through the hands of authors, editors, committees, scribes, and translators for 2 millennia. So, we are left with a startling conclusion. The sacred texts that are often presented as the perfect, inerrant word of a single, divine author are, in fact, historical artifacts of a profoundly human nature. They are a library written by many voices, some of which disagree with each other. They are the edited collection of a political and theological movement that won a battle for control. They are the product of scribal error and intentional revision. They are shaped by the biases and limitations of translation. To acknowledge this is not to dismiss these texts as worthless. On the contrary, it allows us to appreciate them for what they truly are. They are not an infallible rulebook for science or history. They are a record of humanity's ancient and enduring struggle to find meaning. They contain poetry of breathtaking beauty, laws that shaped civilizations, and stories that have inspired acts of both incredible compassion and horrific violence. Understanding their human origins allows us to engage with them critically. It frees us from the impossible burden of trying to reconcile their contradictions and defend their moral atrocities. We can see the parts that reflect the tribalistic brutality of the Bronze Age, and we can appreciate the parts that advocate for justice and mercy. We can finally read the Bible not as a divine monologue, but as a vibrant, messy, and deeply human conversation that has been going on for thousands of years and continues to this day.